The Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. You've probably heard of it. It's often called the most powerful company in history, a corporate titan with its own army, its own navy with the power to wage war and sign treaties. But was it really the all-conquering giant we imagine it to be? Well, in this explainer, we're going to see how that entire story is being completely rewritten.
So let's just dive right into the big question. Was the VOC truly the most powerful company in history? It's a really tempting story, right? This idea of a single corporation just dominating the entire globe. But the real story, as historians are discovering, is so much more complex and honestly way more fascinating.
All right, first things first. To really get what's going on, we have to build the case for why the VOC earned its legendary reputation in the first place. And for that, we have to go all the way back to its absolutely explosive creation at the start of the 17th century.
The rise of the VOC was just unbelievably fast. So the first Dutch fleets get to Asia in the 1590s, but the competition between them got so fierce it was threatening to ruin the whole venture. So in 1602, the Dutch government basically forced them to merge, creating the United East India Company. And here's the kicker. It was granted a 21-year monopoly and given powers that sound more like a country than a company. It could literally wage war, build forts, and sign treaties. By 1619, it had set up its Asian capital at Batavia, creating a central hub for a massive, rapidly expanding empire of trade.
And the growth was just staggering. Now forget for a second about the famous voyages back to Europe with spices. Look at this chart. This shows the explosion of the VOC's trade within Asia itself. We're talking shipping volume that grew by more than 7 times in just a few decades. The company wasn't just an import-export business, it was building its own massive trade network that spanned a continent.
So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, case closed, right? It was huge, it was powerful, it was growing at an incredible rate. But not so fast. This is where the real historical debate kicks in. The question becomes, how much did the VOC actually change the world it entered?
This quote from historian Tonio Andrade just puts it perfectly. How influential was it, really? Did the VOC show up and completely revolutionize Asian trade? Or was it just a new, very powerful player in a game that was already well underway? Answering this takes us way beyond a simple story of European dominance and into something much, much more interesting.
So to get to the bottom of this, we need to look at an old idea that really shaped how we saw Asian trade for decades. And it all centers on this one concept, known as the peddling trade.
Early on, historians were really split. On one side, you had this view from J.C. Van Leur that saw pre-European Asian trade as basically a peddling trade. You know, lots of small-time merchants making one-off trips with luxury goods. But then, a later wave of historians, like Mylink Rulofsa, argued the complete opposite, that Asia already had these vast, highly organized trade networks dealing in bulk goods. And the difference here is huge. One view sees a kind of primitive system just waiting to be modernized, while the other sees a sophisticated world that the VOC had to figure out how to fit into.
So let's be super clear about this term, peddling trade. It doesn't just mean small-time sellers. Van Leur's big point was that the whole system lacked large, permanent commercial structures. He argued that trade was personal, it was ad hoc, and in his view, that made the Asian economy less rational, less predictable, and ultimately less sophisticated than the corporate structure the VOC brought to the table. For a long time, that was the core assumption.
So what happened to that idea of a peddling trade? Well, as historians started digging into non-European sources, re-examining archives, the whole thing just started to fall apart. And what they uncovered was a pre-modern Asia that was way more dynamic and powerful than anyone had previously imagined. Today, the modern consensus is probably best described by this phrase, interactive dominance. And this is a game changer. The idea here is that European success wasn't some one-sided story of conquest. No, instead, the VOC often had to negotiate, it had to partner with, and it often had to rely on powerful local rulers, merchants, and financiers. It was a participant in an already complex system, not just the master of it. And if you want a perfect, stunning example of that reality, look no further than this. Virji Vohra was an Indian merchant who was so incredibly wealthy that he was a major creditor to the English East India Company, the VOC's biggest rival. This quote from an English official basically says, whatever we do, we absolutely cannot afford to upset this guy because we owe him a ton of money. I mean, this just completely flips the script on who we think held all the power in these relationships. And the evidence for this new view is just
It's overwhelming. I mean, get this. In China, a single family's trading empire, the Zheng family, was likely more profitable than the entire global VOC. Militarily, Asian states often fought the VOC to a standstill or even defeated them in battle. And technology? That was not a one-way street. Ideas and innovations like musketry were flowing in all directions, creating a truly global exchange of knowledge.
Okay, so if the VOC wasn't this simple conqueror that just overturned an existing system, what was its actual role? How should we really understand its impact? Well, there's a really cool analogy from our own networked world that is incredibly helpful here.
Here's a great way to think about it. The VOC's official trade routes, the ones we can see in all the European archives, they were like the surface web, visible, documented, easy to track. But underneath all that was a deep web of existing Asian trade networks that was hundreds of times larger. This was the real infrastructure of commerce. The VOC didn't invent the Internet of trade, it just built a very powerful website on top of it.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, the VOC was, without a doubt, a powerful force for creating denser global connections. But maybe its most important legacy isn't what it did to the world, but what its story reveals about the world. And what it reveals is a pre-modern Asia that was already incredibly powerful, incredibly dynamic, and deeply interconnected long before the Europeans arrived in force. Which leaves us with a final thought. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. What if the VOC's greatest impact wasn't as a revolutionary force that changed everything, but as a revealing one that finally showed us the complex, powerful, globalized world that was already there?